Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this online seminar of the Central Asia program at the George Washington University in partnership with the Davis Center for Russian Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. We are delighted to receive you today to discuss the new Russian exile, Russian migration to Central Asia and the South Caucasus. As you all know, there have been waves of Russian fleeing first the war, and then in September, the partial mobilization to Central Asia in particular, and that has really kind of reshaped the relationship between Russia and its neighboring countries and kind of reversing the roles of who is who and who is helping who. And so for that, we have a great group of scholars today who will be helping us deciphering, disentangling what is happening today. I will still begin by giving the floor to my colleague Stephen Jones, the director of the program on Georgian Studies and professor of modern Georgian history at Ilyas State University, who will be introducing the South Caucasus part. And then we will be receiving Nargis Kasenova, director of the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, who will be moderating the Central Asia part. And as speakers, we have with us a dear friend of all our institution, Alima Bisenova, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Nazarbayev University, Shota Kakabadze, Junior Policy Analyst at the Georgian Institute of Politics, and Jan Matusevich, PhD candidate in Cultural Anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, currently based. Welcome, everybody, and Stefan, I give you the floor.
Okay, welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending. I will be introducing Shota Kakabadze in a few minutes, but let me just say a few words of my own about what we're observing in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. I'm going to focus on the South Caucasus. So I want to give some sort of broad brushstrokes, and then I'm going to hand it over to Shota, who will obviously deal with this in more detail. He's on the ground. He has a much better understanding of the current situation. But let me just start. Migration has always been central in the history of the South Caucasus. At times in the Soviet period, immigration was seen as a painful economic and political threat for the small South Caucasian nations. But historically, migration has also brought benefits to the region in terms of cultural diversity and economic growth. And indeed, when one thinks about migration, its role in Caucasian history, it really is one of the major characteristics in its political and economic history. Today, however, the sudden Russian immigration since Russia's partial mobilization in September has intensified domestic political tensions in all three states. The reaction to the Russian influx underlines the very diverse interests of the republics in the region and their different levels of political and economic interdependence with Russia. Armenia, for example, has strong economic and security dependence on Russia. And Armenians view the Russian immigration perhaps a little more benevolently. Though Russia's lack of support for Armenia in the clashes with Azerbaijan this September is leading to skepticism among Armenians, unusually, about Russia's reliability. In Georgia, the large Ukrainian immigration was received sympathetically, given Georgia's own experience of war with Russia in 2008. But notably, many fewer Ukrainians went to Azerbaijan or Armenia for sanctuary. The Russian influx has caused hostility on the street from Georgians who normally have little animus against ordinary Russians. And the Russian presence has become part of a political struggle between the governing Georgian Dream Party, which does not wish to antagonize Russia, and an opposition, including some major civil society organizations in Georgia, which want to end the visa-free regime with Russia. Currently, Russians can enter Georgia for 1 year visa-free. Despite the influx of money brought in by Russians, which is good for small businesses and government revenues in the form of taxes, so for example, Georgian GDP since last September registered an 8.8% increase. And in Armenia, it's even higher at 13%. But despite this, there is significant pressure in all three republics as a result of the Russian influx on the local rental market, on services, on the labor market, especially in IT professions, on real estate, and on prices. Georgia's social media and Armenia's is full of stories about evictions of local students forced out by the increased rental prices generated by Russian demand. Popular reactions to the Russian visitors varies from republic to republic, but in Georgia there are clearly resentments, especially among Georgian youth. How will it affect their employment prospects? Why is the visa regime with Russia so liberal? How will it affect Georgian security? What are the demographic consequences for small, impoverished nations where the young are leaving for abroad at alarming rates? The Georgian government tells us that the numbers are not much different from a traditional tourist season and that many Russians are moving on. But the question is, how many will stay? And how deep will the Russian presence be or extend, for example, into the Georgian economy? Russian investments in strategic industries like electricity and Georgia's financial sector are already extensive. And in the Armenian economy, Russian ownership is essentially an economic stranglehold. On the other hand, many Russians are there because of their hostility to Putin. And the Russian state no longer has the capacity, as in the past, to use Russian minorities to influence the domestic politics of former Soviet republics. Arguably, the Georgian church is a more effective instrument of Russian influence than the Russian professionals now settled in Tbilisi. There is no doubt, however, that the FSB is using the migration to expand its networks in the region. I'm going to finish now. This is an issue which is still fluid. Much depends on the outcome of the war. But if I were a Russian government official, I would be far more focused on the impact on Russia's economic and demographic situation at home as a result of the outmigration of its young professionals, most of them young men, than on the putative advantages Russian citizens might bring to imperial Russian policy in the former Soviet republics. I think that's all basically that I wanted to say. I'm going to now hand it over to Shota. Shota Kakabadze is a junior policy analyst at the Georgian Institute of Politics, and he received his MA and his PhD at the University of Tartu in Estonia. His main research interests include discourses on national identity, foreign policy, and the Eastern Partnership. So I'd like to hand it over to Shota. Shota, thank you.
Thanks, Professor Jones, for your kind introduction, and good morning to those over the other side of Atlantic, and good afternoon, actually, in Georgia, because it's already quite late afternoon here. It's my pleasure to be at this panel and discuss this very important issue. Professor Jones pretty much nicely outlined all these key areas in which we see the problems regarding the Russian migration, but I'll try to go a little bit deeply and kind of explain why these are the problems, and then we can also discuss in details during the Q&A session, I guess. Well, there are 4 dimensions I would like to focus during this very short talk. First, this is a humanitarian dimension of this issue, then economic, political, and security dimension. Starting with humanitarian, well, if we take it simply, Russians coming to the border of Georgia, escaping the mobilization, escaping the fact that they don't want to be the killers or they don't want to go to war. It is a humanitarian issue. It's an issue of refugees trying to, escape and get in your country. So simply speaking, from international humanitarian law, Georgia has responsibility to take them in because they're the refugees. At the same time, there's an issue that usually Georgian territory is used as a transit zone. And according to some data, about half of those came in, they didn't stay in Georgia, they have already left. And the reason for it is that in the first weeks of mobilization, plane tickets for Turkey, Armenia from Russia skyrocketed. I mean, the prices, they were not available anymore. And since Georgia shares the border with Turkey and Armenia, and also it kind of way provides the roads to other Middle Eastern countries, for Russians, it was an easy way to get in. Like they would get in Georgia, There are cases, some of them would simply take a shower somewhere, maybe take a little nap, and then go right on the Turkish border. So in a way, it's not so black and white. There are cases when they use it as a transit. But then, of course, there's those who stay. And those who stay usually are the political activists, opposition activists, those who fear persecution from Putin's regime. And for them, Georgia in a way became a safe haven where they could, like meet, discuss the liberal Russia, how post-Putin Russia should look like, etc. For instance, I know cases when they opened a bookstore in the center of Tbilisi, which sells books that are banned in Russia. They opened bars, restaurants where they gather and discuss politics, some other issues. I personally know one Russian who told me that it was so nice to live in a country where you could wave the Ukrainian flag and not get arrested for it. So in a way, there's this dimension of Russian migration also, which is an important dimension and cannot be overlooked. However, there's an economic dimension which has been a bit problematic, and as Professor Jones also has mentioned, because those Russians who migrated to Georgia usually are upper middle class who have high income, they work remotely, and they're able to afford high prices for the apartment, something average Georgians cannot do. Currently, two-bedroom apartment in Tbilisi costs on average $1,500, which is quite expensive. It's almost the New York apartment prices. And this makes life for Georgians quite complicated. And this in a way contributes to this antagonism, this feeling of, like annoyance towards Russians in Georgia. Secondly, they have also in a way driven up prices for daily products, food, because demand is really high. They're able to afford it, and that makes it slightly difficult for Georgians to live in a daily life. But then there's a political dimension, because in a way, and I fully understand that, it's very difficult emotionally also to see in the streets Russians, like enjoying their daily life, being happy, while there are hundreds of Ukrainians dying in Ukraine, and while Georgia is still occupied by Russia. And Georgia, in a way, is still officially in war with Russia, because we have a ceasefire agreement with Russia, but we don't have a peace treaty, which means that we are technically still in war. And this contributes to this feeling that, like, there's something wrong. Like when you see this many Russians in the street, there's something not right. And Georgian political class remains quite polarized, and it also makes it very difficult to have a normal discussion and gets up into this political debate, which is more partisan rather than on subject. And the same introduction of the visa regime, there has been a proposition from the opposition party and immediately rejected by the ruling party because it's from the opposition party. And there, of course, something which can be discussed, because since there's no diplomatic relations between Georgia and Russia, it's technically more complicated to have a visa regime, because then it has to go through the Swiss embassy and it takes time, or it has to be done at the border, but at the border is kind of a procedure. It's the same. You show your passport, then you either get a stamp or not. So it's kind of the same. But the thing is, the discussion was never about this technicalities. The discussion was, like, this is opposition wanting it, ruling party is not willing to do it. So it became this political polarization, not actual discussion about the subject. And lastly, there's a security dimension. And as mentioned before, Georgia is still formally in war with Russia. And obviously, such a large number of Russians coming in Georgia creates the security challenges for Georgia. And I'm sure Georgian authorities are trying to vet them and make sure that those who probably pose a threat to Georgia are not allowed in. But it's very difficult when, hundreds of thousands of Russians suddenly pour to your border. It's very difficult to really vet them carefully and thoroughly. And there is a possibility that those who pose a threat get in Georgia. So there's also the dimension, which is very important. And lastly, what I also wanted to mention here is that there has, in the Caucasus also, and as also Professor Jones has mentioned, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia are very different in terms of their foreign policy trajectories, in terms of where they stand. And Armenia has been a popular place for those who have no strong political views against Putin's regime. For instance, I also know some of the Russians who first emigrated to Armenia, and then they moved to Georgia. And the reason was that, you know, we escaped this Z symbols everywhere from Russia. They went to Armenia and they saw this symbols also in Armenia, and they were like, that's not what we came here for. And then they immigrated to Georgia. So there's also this dimension. Or they would like to go to Turkey because it's cheaper than Georgia, like apartments are cheaper, food is cheaper, and there is that segment of Russian immigrants who come to Georgia and then they move to Turkey because it's cheaper. And then Georgia in a way becomes this haven for opposition usually. And the same actually also applies to Belarus, because since 2020, the August 2020, the famous events in Belarus, there are a lot of Belarusian opposition who is currently based in Georgia, and they also meet here, discuss politics, etc. So that will be very briefly from my side, and probably we'll get into more detail during the Q&A session. Thanks again.
Steven, you're muted.
Nagis, should we hand it over to you now?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. And sorry, I joined somewhat late. Let's move to Central Asia now, and I think we already can note some similarities with what is happening in the South Caucasus, with what is happening in Central Asia, but there are also differences that we will discuss the similarities and differences, I hope. Well, people who study Central Asia are used to migration from our region to Russia, and these were ethnic Russians, and not only deciding to move there permanently. These are, of course, Central Asian labor migrants who go there to make living, to support their families. So seeing the movement in the opposite direction feels somewhat surreal. As the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine and developments inside Russia feel surreal and nightmarish. If we take a broader historical perspective, it's not the first time Russian citizens are fleeing their country. It's also not the first time our region is the recipient of of big influxes of Russians, and of course those movements had immediate repercussions on the ground, but also medium and long-term implications. So what is happening now? What are the reactions? What are the local reactions? How local societies are reacting to the presence of these new Russian migrants? What the local governments are doing, and what are the implications what are potential implications of this influx? And to discuss these questions, we have two excellent panelists with us today, and I'll introduce them, and then I'll give the floor to them for their remarks. We will start with Dr. Alima Besenova, who is an associate professor of anthropology at Nazarbayev University in Astana. She specializes in urban anthropology, anthropology of Islam, post-colonial studies, and intellectual history. She has published her work in English and Russian in the journals Religion, State and Society, Europe-Asia Studies, Об Imperio, Новое литературное обозрение, Социология власти. Welcome, Halima.
Thank you, Nargis, and thank you for this kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me. So in Kazakhstan, we now talk about waves of migration from Russia, and the first wave was from, actually this 2022 has been extraordinary, of course, year for everybody, and for Kazakhstan in terms of migration as well, because 4 million people have come to Kazakhstan, the foreigners, and 4.3 million people, and 4.1 million people left. And now we'll try to decipher our statistics, which is a bit difficult because our statistical agencies, they report in quotas usually, but sometimes for the sake of the public, like when there are these huge influxes, they also report. So the first wave was with the start of the war, right? The wave, and from 24th February and until the middle of March, 60,268 citizens were reported coming to who came to Kazakhstan. Half of them left actually then. Then the second wave from the 21st September until October, 3rd October, almost 300,000, 281,548 citizens of Russian Federation were reported. This is the Pogranichная служба, the border service of the Committee of the National Security Reporting. But also most of them left, not most of them, actually less than half of them. Of these who's entered, which is about 300,000, 147,000 remained in Kazakhstan. Also, we have, this is the reporting of the border service. We also have the Ministry of Justice who issues the tax numbers. And of the tax numbers in this year, we also had a recording number of tax numbers issued to the foreigners. 198,000 tax numbers were issued until in 3 quarters of this year. But most of them were surprisingly for Uzbek citizens. 91,454 tax numbers were given to Uzbek citizens, and 74,371 tax numbers were given to Russian citizens. So, but it shows that Uzbek citizens, I guess, are less conspicuous although they are visible to the authorities who are registering them, but I guess to the public debate and like what to do with migration and so on. And of course, unlike Georgia, Kazakhstan is a friendly country to the Russian Federation, where it's a part of the Eurasian Union. But of course, this kind of the scenes at the border, of course, the dramatic scenes at the Lars, but also dramatic scenes in crossings like in Troitsk and other. We have the longest border, the longest land border with Russia. Of course, it was embarrassing, I imagine, for the government of the Russian Federation, and it showed that at least a considerable number of people do not want to fight for this war and do not want to participate in this. So according to the people are received because we have these agreements between Russia and people can work once they receive this tax identification number. People of the Russian Federation, they can find jobs, they can open businesses, they can be individual entrepreneurs. So there are many opportunities for them. There are also opportunities for them to work distantly from sort of distance work from Russia. And also if they work, it's also they're taxed according to our laws. So for instance, if a foreigner comes to work, like they only tax the social tax, they also the pension fund and so on. So we have these agreements which make it easier for them to be incorporated into our economy and also cultural. Of course, most of our countries citizens are bilingual, so it makes it easier for these people to sort of. But of course, it's also maybe not as dramatic as in Georgia, but it is taxing for the rental market, for the job market, it creates this increased competition, and also public debate about that. We are an independent country, like different kind of debates about the role of the languages and the fact that how they should be employed, should they but our legislation is set up, like I would say, surprisingly well to receive these people, also to issue tax numbers, to make them sort of fit into the economy and into the life. Also, of course, there is statistics, but there is also personal experiences. And for me, as a person who works in social sciences and humanities, I, of course, saw the fleeing of my colleagues, right, in social sciences and humanities in the first wave. And also in the second wave, and in the second wave, it's also for the people, like most of the receiving cities are Astana and Almaty, of course, although there is also a number of the border cities like Kostanay, like Uсть-Kamenogorsk, who are receiving. So there is a migration. It shows that the saldo of migration is positive in Almaty, in Astana, also in Shymkent even. So with these people, let's say, are seen even in the public places. In the, you can see young Russian, mainly males, but also females and families and such. I'm also driving, so I often see like Russian plates, and I often play this game, what region is this? And I recognize the plates of Chelyabinsk, Omsk, Orenburg, but also Russian plates, plates of the Chechen Republic. What's important for us, I guess, it's like the divisions and interethnic relations within our own country. And the divisions in our countries are like linguistic, cultural, and interethnic as well. Some people, you know, have supported the Russian special operation in Ukraine. Some people were vehemently against this operation, and so Russians are coming into this divided society. And there are concerns about this, but of course, interestingly, they are, if let's say the sentiments of supporting the war and so on were understandably more spread among the Russian population. These Russian newcomers, they do not support this war, so this is an interesting situation. So maybe these people could be sort of an antidote to like what's the sum of the interethnic divisions that we have. And the war actually changed the situation in many places. That surprisingly, even though people who previously identified themselves as, you know, I'm the Soviet person, like I'm, you know, identify with the Soviet Union, they started to identify more with Kazakhstan, because even though they do identify with the main language is Russian, they do not want what happened to Ukraine to happen in Kazakhstan, right? And this is a clear, I was working for one of the government agencies, and there were clear signs, except for one region, for all border regions except for one. I will not name this region as it is a confidential information, but that's a situation that there is a strong support for Kazakhstani political identities, that Kazakhstan is not anti-Russia, but it's not Russia. We have our own culture, we have our own language, we have our own state, which has been very efficient in receiving these migrants. And so far, it shows that we have received the largest number, at least from the second wave of migrants, because people did not have choice, right, or where to go. So their only choice was Kazakhstan, right? So for many people, it was sort of the only choice and the last choice to escape mobilization and to at least to think of what to do with their lives. So this is the situation currently, and we did not have any street protests, although there are concerns and public debates on social media and so on, but so far, in terms of the public order and also migrants following the law and order has been, I would say, very good situation. So this is the current state. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Alima. Two quick questions. You mentioned a big number of Uzbek citizens who received these identification numbers. Would it be right to assume that these are Uzbeks who worked in Russia, and that this new kind of wave of migration is a mixed wave.
Yes, of course.
This is a sort of Russian ethnic, but also like Central Asian wave.
Yes, of course, it would make sense. And also maybe these Uzbeks are going back to Russia. Like, we don't know where, if they're staying in, like issuing tax ID does not mean that the person has to stay in our country. He can just carry out tax ID and have a bank account and can sort of function in the country. It is not a residence permit, it's just a tax number. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, although the regulations in Russia of labor migrants is worsening and getting more rigid. So it seems that there is an option that they will not go back to Russia. We'll see. And the second question. We do see this sort of consolidation of Kazakhstani identity as a result of the shock.
We do see a consolidation of Kazakhstani identity. People who are.
Are you surprised by it? Are you surprised by it?
No, I think it's a human. It's sort of. It's a fear of, and it's a desire that, you know, we stay peaceful and stable. And this country has sort of prided itself, has been proud of, you know, being peaceful and stable for a long time. And people sort of see it as a value, as a very strong value, which they don't want to lose. And that's why they identify politically with Kazakhstan strongly. And they, even the people who previously were like not willing to learn Kazakh, they say, okay, let's, whatever it takes to stay, you know, like peaceful and stable, let's do it.
Yeah. And it seems that Kazakhstan will need to develop a new migration policy, perhaps, because until now we had it for ethnic Kazakhs returning to Kazakhstan. There has been a policy, but if we will continue.
But we already have a policy within the Eurasian Union, right? So we can, these people, we don't need a special policy because we have policies within Eurasian Union, which allows citizens of Eurasian Union.
These are regulations, that's not a policy. What do you do with these new people, you know, kind of how do you provide for the jobs and what do you do with the schools and so on and so forth. But let's move to Jan, and then we will continue the discussion on the implications. Our second panelist is Jan Matusevich, who is a PhD candidate in cultural anthropology at the Graduate School of the City University of New York. His doctoral research is on the experiences of Russian exiles who have relocated to Central Asia since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He has previously worked on transnational migrant communities linking Central Asia to Russia, Turkey, and South Korea. And he previously held the position of Associate Policy Officer at the International Center of Migration Policy in Vienna. And he's currently active as a freelance journalist based in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. Jan, what's your take on this situation?
Hi, thank you for having me. So I think I can provide maybe a little bit more ethnographic detail about what I've experienced, mostly based on interviews that I've been doing in Kyrgyzstan, both in Bishkek and Osh, which is the two primary sites where I've been working. So there are a couple of issues. I mean, I know that this was talked about by the previous speaker. There's the issue of the migration statistics being sort of a mess in much of the post-Soviet space. And part of the reason is because you're looking at border crossings and then you're trying to see how many people are actually staying. So there's been a wide range of numbers. I think some of it maybe has been a little bit sensationalist and on the high end. And maybe, you know, in terms of estimates of how many people are actually staying, it could be, I think in the end, much lower than some of the numbers that are being thrown out there. But I think overall in Central Asia, you're still looking at over, you know, several 100,000 potentially, you know, if you're taking Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan and putting them all together. Because you have people obviously opening up bank accounts, which is a good metric, but also doesn't necessarily mean that they're staying. You have people getting tax ID numbers, but also not necessarily staying. So it's kind of a, everything's in a bit of a state of flux. In terms of the different groups of people, I think, as was noticed before, the first wave that came right after the invasion, you kind of had more of this kind of conscientious objection to the Putin regime. And I think particularly in Kyrgyzstan, which was, has been sort of seen as an oasis, a relative oasis of free speech and democracy in the region. A lot of the people that came with the first wave in Bishkek were activists, had very strong political positions, and have done community organizing and things like that in Bishkek. And it's a pretty tight-knit community. And they've made the kind of the conscious choice to really settle in Bishkek. Then starting with the mobilization now, you have a very diverse group of people that are coming from all parts of Russia. People in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's also people from the Far East, from people from I've also met from the Northern Caucasus, from Tatarstan, from all over. It's really, I've made a map of where people are from, and it's very, very diverse. And then I think an important other factor that another group of people that is not always talked about is that a lot of Kyrgyz labor migrants have dual citizenship. So they also have Russian passports. So some of those returning to Kyrgyzstan, and I know Tajikistan and Uzbekistan as well, are returning because they recently obtained Russian citizenship and are afraid of being drafted into the military. So you also have sort of locals that are coming back, but with a different passport. Some of them only have a Russian passport actually, and are trying to renew or get their Kyrgyz, Uzbek, or Tajik citizenship back so that they can go to another country on it. So I've met several people who worked in Russia for many years, had Russian citizenship, were settled in Russia, left to escape mobilization back to their home country, and are now renewing their or reapplying for their initial citizenship in order to go work in South Korea or Turkey or in Gulf states, or there are also now opportunities to work in Poland, Bulgaria. I've heard of places like this. So these are all of these different categories of people fall under sort of the general rubric of Russian citizens. But there are a lot of differences in terms of class and background. Another important thing to keep in mind is that, there's obviously a hierarchy of destinations, and Central Asia is a little bit of this, of a plan B for virtually anybody, because for Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, you only need an internal passport to travel. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind is that, I think I looked at the last statistics, something like 35% of Russians have a valid foreign travel passport. So the vast majority of Russians only have their internal documents. So if they want to escape the country, their options are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia, basically, that's it. There is a lot of onward travel, right? Those who are more well off, who have the means, who have remote jobs, they're trying to move on to Southeast Asia or Turkey, or, if they have family connections to the United States, Canada, or Europe. But I think for many, many people that I've met, I can't, obviously this is, anecdotal evidence, but a lot of them don't have foreign travel passports. And so they're effectively stuck in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, and have to find a way to make do. And so it's obviously difficult because there are plenty of vacancies available, but salaries are very low, particularly in Kyrgyzstan. And the housing prices, just like Shota mentioned in Georgia, in Bishkek, at one point apartments were going for $1,000 a month, right? Which is, I think, way more than double the average salary there. So it's it creates a difficult situation where you also as roommates, they're sharing flats, sharing houses, so that they can afford the rent. And so, yeah, and I would push back against maybe the there's a little bit of a stereotype of Russians as being well off and all sort of IT workers and professionals. And I think in the case of Central Asia, that's not always the case. They're a significant portion, but there are also people that are students. There are people who were, kind of blue collar workers, and people who don't have finances to fall back upon. And I think, and then, I think another interesting element to talk about is the fact that you have also a lot of Russians suddenly having to rely on Central Asian connections that they had back home in Russia. And often it's an employer-employee relationship, right? So I've met several people who ran businesses, let's say, they ran a construction company and they had a lot of Kyrgyz and Uzbek workers. And now those workers are providing shelter for their former bosses, right? So, I mean, it's a really kind of fascinating reversal of roles that's happening. And you have now people who used to be managers and running entrepreneurs working as, sort of informally as electricians and plumbers and things like that. I've met people who are doing that. So it's a state of flux. I mean, it's reminiscent, I think, of kind of the situation that happened, during the Russian Civil War, and where you had, Russian cab drivers in Morocco, and there are stories like that. And so you're seeing similar kind of situation happening in Central Asia. And finally, I think an element that's that has been, there's a very deep sense of unease, I think, among a lot of the new arrivals, because they are not very well informed about Central Asia. And I think that's obviously a result of like an imperial mindset and the fact that they never had to think about this region. But as a result, they kind of see the Central Asian countries as being subservient to Russia. And hence there's this fear of potential extradition, or that the Russian FSB are, they're going to send agents in to arrest people. I mean, there's a very high level of paranoia among Russian new arrivals in Kyrgyzstan. I think it's been heightened by the recent events in Kyrgyzstan. So the crackdown on the media, the crackdown on protests against the handing over of the Kampirabad reservoir to Uzbekistan. So these types of things, this crackdown on civil society, some Russians, they read Kyrgyz media, they follow the Kyrgyz websites, and I've heard that they're worried, and they're afraid that, well, what if Kyrgyzstan becomes like Russia? And so I think it's hard to say, how this will all pan out, because a lot of people, they can only plan for the next weeks and months ahead, right? And the last thing I want to mention, I think I'll conclude on that. There's also, I think, a very interesting gendered kind of element to this whole migration, where it's, has been mentioned, it's mostly men now that are fleeing mobilization. And so they've left their businesses and real estate and families, and everything has been put on the shoulders of Russian women that have stayed behind. And I think it's an interesting dynamic, because you have a lot of the women are actually making choices for these men. So a lot of the men that I met, they said, well, my wife just bought me a ticket to Kyrgyzstan. I didn't know where I was going, but she told me I needed to get out. So there's an interesting, they're not, I was asking many, are you planning on bringing your spouses to Kyrgyzstan? And they were unsure, because they said, well, I've handed everything, all my business, everything that I do, I've handed over to my spouse. And so that's an interesting, I think, element to see how this will evolve. But I'll stop it there, I think, and then people can ask more specific questions.
If I could quickly come in, Nargis.
Yes.
I can see that there are some questions, one from Alexei Sobchenko and also from Thomas Simons, about the nature of the Russian influx into Georgia and South Caucasus more generally, but let's focus on Georgia for now. Shota, I wonder if you could tell us a few words about the types of Russians that are coming in. Can we also talk about these various waves in in the Georgian case, are they, to go to what Jan is mentioning, are they primarily young professionals, or do we also see Russians who perhaps, plumbers, electricians, and various other types? Well, can you give us some characterization of the Russian influx, and also if you have some sense, or I know it's a very confused time right now, but some sense of the numbers?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I've been following the Q&A as well, so I'll try to briefly address some of the questions very briefly that were related to Georgia. And numbers are slightly difficult, and it also relates to the question about the visa regime, because Georgia has a very simple visa regime with Russians. You can come in for 1 year, no need to register anywhere, and then you can leave just for a day and then come back again, and this 1 year starts all over again. That means for them it's very easy, to come in Georgia. Therefore, when they cross in the border, they usually come here as a tourist, and they can stay here for 1 year as a tourist, unless they, buy property here, apply for residence permit or for refugee status, etc. Because of that, it's very difficult, to see how many of them are actually staying here and how many are actually visiting. But by different calculations, it's around 200,000 of those have entered or crossed the border, but out of this 200,000, I believe at least half of them have left. Because some of them come here, then they try to arrange their next destination, which is usually in Europe. Serbia, for instance, is a very popular destination. Then Germany, after mobilization, Germany announced that if they want to get a refugee status, like fleeing the mobilization, they can go to German embassy in Georgia. So they would come in Georgia and go to the embassy to apply for it. So what I'm trying to say, if you look at the border crossing, the numbers are quite high. But when you look at how many of them are staying, that might differ, and we don't know, we don't have final numbers yet. And the issue is most of them want to stay in the capital, and that also increases population in Tbilisi and creates all these problems with, like houses, transportation, etc. Regarding their characterization, again, there are not that many studies which will show it, but from what I see in the media, from what I've read, most of them are still, upper middle class. And yes, we can also see these two waves of migration. The first wave in February, when those who were able to, migrate had the finances, and they easily migrated, and they are upper middle class. Also, there's a nice contrast in Tbilisi. You can see, you can go to coffee shops, which is just full of Russians, and those are kind of a fancy coffee shops where, you can get this nice coffee, and that's usually a popular destination for this more like hipster lifestyle Russians. And then the rest of coffee shops where Georgians usually go. And then you have the second wave in autumn, and yes, then those who came in Georgia, they were less well off than during the first wave, but for them it's not as easy to get a job in Georgia as it would be in the countries which are members of the Eurasian Economic Union. So because of that, I think Georgia is not the #1 choice for those who are not able to work remotely. So that is an issue there. And very briefly, I also respond to a question regarding the opposition and what Georgian Dream, the ruling party, could have done or needs to do. I think the problem which is at the moment in Georgia is that there's extremely low trust in the ruling party, extremely low trust in the government, and that creates this sense of fear, insecurity, and you don't trust your own security services, your own government, and that kind of is a problem at the moment. And the problem with the ruling party is that it pretends that it's not, the issue of Russians doesn't exist at all. They say it's just the tourists, nothing special going on. And I think that is an issue at the moment. So they could either use it as showing that, Georgia, which is actually a fact, that Georgia provides a safe place for Russian opposition TV channels have relocated to Tbilisi, Radio Liberty, Russian service has relocated to Tbilisi. This could be something Georgia government could use as a PR move, but they don't do it. And there's this sense that they pretend problem doesn't exist. And that creates then this whole issue around Russian migrants in Georgia and this political debates we have at the moment. I think it's very briefly from my side.
Thank you very much, Shota. Can we ask the same questions to Alima and Jan? The first one on what's the regime, visa regime, permit regime, registration, and so on. How long they can stay, and whether they can just easily go out for 1 day and come back, and these kind of things for Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and also what are the government attitudes. We know that Takayev said that we'll take care of these people. Their situation is desperate. Do we know more about the Kazakh government's attitude, and also the same for the Kyrgyz government? What are they? What did they say? Alimash, can we start with you and then go to you?
Okay, so the citizens of European Union can stay in Kazakhstan up to 90 days without visa. Then they should either register or leave, but then they can re-enter. So it means that people who can stay 90 days, leave, and then come back. Also, what other regulations? You have to get tax number is just necessary to function, to get anything, like everywhere you go, just it's required. But you also have to register in order to get a bank account currently, like in some banks. In some banks, you can actually get only this tax number, but also you have to be registered in order to go to school, right? For instance, or to get some services. So it's, you have to register in the apartment that you're living. So the host of the apartment should register you, or like the hostel or the hotel. So this is an issue. So the registration is also needed, that for further sort of more in-depth functioning. The government attitude has been positive. The government has facilitated the sort of created these reception facilities like ZON, Center of Service to the, where we have seen like so as not to overload the issue, the offices that issue these tax numbers to and show other services to locals. They've created like separate centers for migrants or migrants from Russia and other places as well. Other foreigners can also receive this tax number. What else? Businesses do relocate, like InDriver has relocated, TikTok that is opening. It's so many like big business, also automobile industry is relocating. So Kazakhstan is actually is seeing some, let's say, positive sides of not that not to say that we are, like as Russians say, "Komu vojna, komu mать родна," not that we wanted any of this to happen to us, but yeah, on the business side, we're seeing some good signs for our economy. What else? There were questions about like 4 million.
Yeah, let's move to Jan and then we'll go to,
okay.
to other questions. Yes, Jan, what's the situation in Kyrgyzstan?
In terms of the government response on the numbers or the procedure, right?
Yes, procedures, and also the government, which are
so basically, as a member state of the Eurasian Economic Union, Russians have 30 days to register from arrival, but they can also, leave the country every 30 days and come back and get around registration that way. Registration, I mean, it's the same. It's I think a Soviet legacy of the way that registration works. You also have to get the host of your apartment to do it. Just like in Russia and other places, landlords refuse to do so. Therefore, you have to use sort of intermediary kind of gray companies that will register you at some address where you don't actually live for a fee. And that fee has tripled actually. So, I think it was something like between 200 and 500 som before, and now it's, I've heard even, 5,000 som, so upwards of $50, $60 to get registered through these companies. The registration is then valid for 6 months, and you have to renew it every 6 months. But once you have this registration, you can open a bank account, you can work. So I think that's what, that presents kind of a challenge for the whole refugee discourse, because there's no incentive for people to apply for any form of international protection or asylum, because they effectively have access to the labor market and can enjoy legal status. So So there are no issues on that end. In terms of the government response, Japarov also said in an interview, I think to the New York Times, right, that that Russians shouldn't fear extradition. But generally speaking, the Kyrgyz government has been very quiet on the topic. And I think that's caused a lot of frustration because, and I think it has to deal more with issues of kind of bad governance in general. That there's a frustration, I think, in Kyrgyz civil society at the fact that the government is in general not doing enough in terms of services, in terms of having a social safety net, and obviously it's a very, economically struggling country. And so I think there's a lot of discontent brewing, but it's not necessarily aimed specifically at the Russians. It's more at the fact that there's no such thing as rent controls. There are no protections for renters. These types of things, and so I think people expect the government to take on a much more active role. But at the moment, they've been very busy with, there have been the border clashes with Tajikistan. There's now the issue over the water issue with Uzbekistan. So they've been preoccupied with that. But there hasn't really been any kind of response at the policy level. It seems like the government is just hoping that this will kind of solve itself, that people will either travel onwards or somehow figure things out, but there hasn't been any kind of concerted response.
Nagis, if I could pursue something that Jan said and hand it over to Shota. One question is the difference between the government and its actions and its policies and the population more generally, right? And in Georgia, for example, there is considerable tension between a population that is more antagonistic and concerned about Russian immigration than a government that tends to play it down as playing a cautious role regarding its relations with Russia. And there's one question here from Mackenzie Tubridi, which touches on that and asks whether the Georgian government's position is a reasonable one, given the situation in terms of trying to moderate, let's say, its response to Russia. Given that Russia still technically, as Shota said, is at war with Georgia and occupies about 20% of its territory. So that's one question. This difference between government and population, what the implications of that are. Could you, for example, see significant protests or disorders emerging because of that tension? The second question that I see here, it says from an anonymous attendee, regarding the economic impact, and I touched on that and talked about the increase in GDP over the last year in both Georgia and Armenia. Can we make connections at all between the influx of young Russian IT specialists and entrepreneurs coming in and boosting, at least for some, the health of the Georgian economy? Shota, if I could ask you to answer.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the questions. I'll start with the last question and I will move to the first one because that would make more sense. Well, regarding the impact, yes, that is the fact, because we see the Georgian currency has been stabilized, because Georgian currency usually gets devaluated a lot around this time of the year when tourism, kind of ends. But it has been stable. It has been actually getting stronger, and it is mostly because of the influx of the money of foreign currency, which comes together with the Russian migrants entering Georgia. But when you look at the statistics, it shows that during the last 9 months, there was about $1 billion, which was the money transfer coming from Russia, and that is a lot for Georgia, since Georgian economy mostly depends on this foreign currency and money coming from tourism. So in that way, it has been a positive impact. It has stabilized Georgian currency. It has contributed to tourism recovery and increasing the economy. And it's 20 hours. Okay. And anyways, it's been in a way, it's been also the main message of the current Georgian government. The ruling party's main message will be that look, like there's a conflict. There are conflicts in the region. Europe is struggling with high inflation. There are the problems, and then we bring you peace and economic prosperity, and that will be the future message of the Georgian dream for the upcoming election in 2024. And we already see these messages coming from the ruling party. And that's in a way also responds to the second question. But to elaborate a bit more about this division between the society and the government, we've seen a couple of protests, also the protests where they were demanding the visa regime for Russians. But as I mentioned before, there's this huge gap between the political class and the society. And while there's this feeling of protest, the feeling of disappointment in the society, politicians, even opposition politicians, are not able to kind of use this momentum. And therefore, there's this distrust towards politicians, whether it's from the opposition position, and that kind of kills the perspective of mobilization from the society. And very briefly, just a very small example, which I think also nicely shows this distrust and kind of insecurity which is in Georgian society. There was a couple of months ago in the streets of Tbilisi, some very strange graffiti started appearing, which looked like a fox, like a cat. There's still disagreement what it looked like, with some Russian signature on it. And immediately the social media exploded and TV exploded, saying that like it's probably Russian intelligence services marking some territories in Tbilisi, because once they're going to invade Georgia, then they'll know which places to bomb, where to go, etc. And there was a serious discussion whether it's Russian intelligence service marking some places in Tbilisi or not, because there was absolute distrust in the government that it would seriously react to this. And in the end, it turned out there was some Russian graffiti artist who was getting drunk, going around the city, drawing the portrait of his cat, and then he got fined for vandalization, etc. But this whole hysteria, which was in the social media, it showed kind of this distrust, this gap between government and society. And the very last, also I think very important, what Georgian government also, at least what people are lacking from the government, is more vocal support for Ukraine, because there's a sense that Georgia is not at least vocally supporting enough of Ukraine, and that has been also feeling in the Georgian society at the moment. Thanks.
Stephen, you are muted.
Okay, Nagis, it's if you want to proceed.
Now I'm muted. We received many questions. I'm afraid won't be able to answer all of them, but let's do our best. We received a question regarding the return of about Russians who migrated outside of Kazakhstan. Are they returning back? And where do Russians go in Kazakhstan?
They mainly go to the capital cities. Also, Shymkent is also the receiving side. Surprisingly, as a megapolis, it's they go where the jobs are, where the opportunities are. To also some of the people who left, those, for instance, ethnic Russian students who went to study in Russia, they have returned. Yeah, but so far there was question about tensions. No, there were no tensions. On the contrary, sort of the what we at least see measurements of the interethnic situation and so on that our think tanks are conducting, showing that in most of the regions there is a strong support for neutrality, stability and peace in Kazakhstan within current Kazakhstan borders. There was a question about schools. We have Russian schools, so it shouldn't be a problem. People should register in order to go to school. That's all.
And there are private schools as well that are not that expensive. Shuta, there was a question about Russians and Ukrainians in Georgia, whether there are tensions between these groups.
I'll have a very brief response to that. So far, there hasn't been any reported incidents or cases when something happened between them. but we have the examples when Russian opposition in Georgia, there's the organization which is called Free Russia, if I'm not mistaken, which is working in Georgia at the moment, and they've been organizing different events when they have been collecting money, different donations for Ukraine, and then sending this to Ukrainian like humanitarian aid for Ukraine. So there has been cases like this, but I'm not really aware of any instances when there has been tension or conflict between Russians and Ukrainians in Georgia at the moment.
Right. Maybe, Short, I can push you a little further on that.
Sure.
And one of the questions also addressed the issue of relations between the Georgian and Ukrainian governments, which have been tense for a number of years, in part because of this muted response by the Georgian government to the war in Ukraine, but also because of this complicated issue of the previous government under President Saakashvili, which had close relations with Ukraine, and the current government, in terms of its anti-Saakashvili stand, is sort of complicating it with an anti-Ukrainian stance at the same time. Can you comment on that?
You're absolutely right that at the moment, current Ukrainian government, the leadership is seen by the Georgian ruling party as pro-Saakashvili, meaning pro-opposition, and is seen clearly as a rival. And this rivalry, kind of this domestic rivalry in Georgia, is transformed or is moved to an international level between Ukraine and Georgia. And this really complicates the relationship between the two countries. I mean, sure, Georgia needs to, and I think that that's the issue with Georgian government at the moment, that it's, despite this, it needs to be more vocal in their support. I think nobody expects that Georgia would go to war with Russia at the moment. And even if it did, I mean, the Georgian military forces and territory are not even comparable to Ukraine in terms of its size, capacity. So that would be ridiculous to expect that Georgia would go to war with Russia at the moment. But I think, yeah, there's this lacking that and not feeling that Georgia is at the right side in this conflict, mostly because of this domestic disagreement with the opposition party. And that is all because, for instance, at the moment, the people working in Ukrainian government, and some of them are being persecuted in Georgia, and they're wanted in Georgia. And this makes it very complicated. And that's an issue, definitely.
Yeah.
Can I raise one question to the panelists? Well, Jan talked about this reversal of roles with, amazing situations when the former manager and, boss would kind of rely on the kindness of his former employees, and, and kind of what a jolt these events give to the imperial mindset. What do you think will happen to this imperial mindset as a result of these ongoing events, and what will be happening on our side with our kind of identity construction, reconstruction, and so on, like, and our relations with Russia, kind of as a former metropole? And I know it's a big question, and but if you have thoughts on it, would be.
Of course, it's a reversal, not complete reversal, but sort of some reversal of former hierarchies, right? Imperial, and I've painted this very, nice picture in Kazakhstan. We're peaceful and stable, and so of course we are, but also like very heated debates about language and about and these debates about should we speak Russian with Russians, and with coming Russians, should they learn Kazakh? Who should learn? So these debates are intensifying, and the I guess investment in Kazakhstani identity is also growing, in a Kazakhstani identity based on the Kazakh language, and also for instance, the government, when it the government sort of trying to be neutral and trying to be on the sort of receiving sides of this investment and businesses and so on, but it's also sometimes it irritates the public when it starts saying, the people who are coming, they have this, they're very qualified, and this is a very imperial, as if, qualified people are coming to modernize. And I think they got the message, and they have stopped this sort of the talk of the qualified people coming to, to our economy, which is, people are coming, and some of them are qualified, some of them are moderately qualified, some of them are less qualified, and they will try to find their niche in our economy, which is hopefully will be also growing, because the businesses are also coming and relocating, Russian businesses, but also importantly international businesses who were previously based in Russia. They're coming to Kazakhstan, mainly those who are covering, for instance, Eurasian region, and so on. So it's and the role of this relocated personnel can be also important in establishing and running these businesses also in a new context, of course. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, identity construction usually requires the other, and let's see what this other will be for us. Shota, can we go to you?
Sure. So here I think that Georgia is a different case from Central Asia and Armenia, and even probably from Azerbaijan, because since 2008 war, Georgia-Russian relations have been extremely tense, and Georgia kind of has been developing isolated from this Russian cultural space. And when you talk, most of the young people in Georgia, they don't really speak Russian, or they probably understand, but they prefer to communicate in English, and English has become a dominant language in Georgia as a foreign language. And I think now we saw with the Russian influx in Georgia that, suddenly Georgian society does not, a younger generation does not speak Russian, and those Russians are kind of finding it difficult to get around unless they speak English as well. And I think one long-term consequences of this, especially if this Russian state, they open up their businesses, etc., is that this Russian cultural space is going to come back in Georgia again, something which has not been here since 2008. And that is probably going to have impact on Georgian national identity, also cultural impact. And that's something also which some of the opposition parties have been using as an argument for introducing the visa regime, that they're afraid of this let's call it post-Soviet identity coming back, which they have been trying to get rid of with the modernization programs, etc. So that will be very briefly my response to the question.
Jan, that's your research. What did you notice? Do you notice any trends? So, sorry, Alima, we'll go to you.
Well, I mean, I think for a lot of people, I saw the question pop up, of how Russians are processing the reality, that Central Asians were discriminated against, systematically for so long, and kind of racism towards Central Asian was so normalized in Russian society. And I think it's definitely, it's a turning point for some. It's a deeply humbling experience, I think, for many, many people, and they're still kind of processing it. So I think there's been a lot of discussion on social media about kind of Russian arrogance, and the fact that, Russian new arrivals are behaving in certain ways that are not respectful to locals and things like that. And that obviously there's anecdotal evidence to point in that direction. I don't doubt that is happening. But there's also, when you have more in-depth discussion with people, there is this reflexive moment. And that's what I'm interested in my research, right? That, and I think those questions I don't have to prod very far for them to come to the surface. I think there's also a sense of shame among some people that I've talked to, a sense of, people are so hospitable here, to, the hospitable response to Russians. And I think, some of the younger generations particularly, they said it wasn't even that they had prejudices towards Central Asians. They didn't even think about them. It was not a part of they didn't think about the region. They didn't think about the labor that these people were doing. They were so invisibilized. And so I think there's a sense of, there's a lot of reflection happening on that. I think what's interesting is that in Bishkek, for example, there are several Russian Kyrgyz organizations that are starting up, that are hosting discussions, that are having open lectures and debates about this, which I think is really interesting. So it's definitely a conversation that's happening on I think many different levels. I also really quickly, I saw someone posted a question of why haven't there been public protests in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. I can speak to Kyrgyzstan. I know that in the Kyrgyz case, there have been a few very, very, very small protests, but people have been, the few people that came out, some of them were arrested by Kyrgyz police for having an unauthorized protest. So there's that element. And then I think there's a sense of fear also that Kyrgyzstan is seen as being pro-Russian, and therefore, maybe we should keep quiet. And then I think there's just also, people are very disoriented, very paranoid, still trying to find their bearings. So I think, going out to a protest is not the first thing that they're going to do if they're trying to find housing and trying to make sense of where they are.
Yeah. And I guess even if most of these people leave our regions, the connections that are set up now, and yeah, they will stay, right? So definitely there are these new sets of connections created between Russia and Central Asia and South Caucasus. We are out of time, but let me go to Stephen for the last remarks.
Well, yeah.
Maybe.
Okay, I just would like to thank everybody, and there's some very interesting comparisons here between the South Caucasus and Central Asia. I think it's worth remembering that this is all happening in the context of some massive sort of geopolitical shifts in terms of Russia's relationship with Central Asia and the South Caucasus. It's interesting to observe, for example, in Armenia, for the first time, we're beginning to see, as a result of Russia's perceived weakness and its lack of reaction to support for Armenia in its war with Azerbaijan, that even although Armenians generally are very positive about Russians, we're beginning to see changes or greater skepticism among Armenians, banning, for example, a number of Russian journalists from entry into Armenia, and as I say, some growing interest in the role, for example, of the European Union and other states in helping Armenia. Maybe different. I'm not saying Russia is going to be left out of the Armenian strategic vision, but we're beginning to see shifts and changes, and in Central Asia and Kazakhstan, of course, as well. So I mean, that's the context I think we should keep in mind when we're discussing this question.
Let's give a very 30 seconds each to our panelists to give us your last remarks, and then we'll wrap up this session. Let's go in the order we started. Shota?
Sure. Thanks again, and thanks for having me. Just very, very small point which I forgot to mention, because usually there was also another very interesting example, when Putin declared about annexation of these 4 territories of Ukraine, and Russian Telegram channels in Georgia, there was a fake message sent around, which was calling for Russians who were living in Georgia to go outside on the main square and protest, that kind of show their support for Putin's decision. And that was clearly a provocation, but most of the Russians who were living here, they didn't. They realized it was a provocation, and they didn't really follow this message. So this kind of shows the threats which still exist with these Russians coming in, but it also shows that those who are staying here, most of them at least, know the context, they realize what's going on, and they're not so easily manipulatable as it might seem from the outside. Thanks. And thanks again for inviting.
Alima?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is a new and an interesting, of course, the circumstances that brought it are tragic and horrible, but this wave of migration is in some ways is a turn to the east, right? That Putin also talked about, and these people are going to see a new sort of reality in the east and in the south, and they're going to go back, and some of them maybe, and their families. So this is going to maybe change those sort of imperial and west-looking sentiments that both sort of west-looking, West imperial and Russian own imperial sentiments that have been dominant in our post-colonial situation.
Well, we are more west-looking now than Russia, in a way. Okay, Jan.
We should be looking into our own instead of looking to the West, I would say, yeah.
Well, we want to be part of the international community. Jan?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's a, you know, despite the difficulty of the situation, it's a fascinating moment to be in Central Asia. It's also, I think, opening up a lot of discussions that are long overdue, particularly, you know, in Russian area studies or post-Soviet studies about imperialism, colonialism, the Soviet legacy. I think, so I think it's good. There's going to be a lot of fascinating research coming out of this. And I think it's also, you know, it puts a spotlight for better or for worse on Central Asia, which I, you know, as someone who's been interested in the region for long, I'm happy to see. You know, this is anecdotal evidence, but Kyrgyz language classes in Bishkek are full, like they've never been before. You have Russians that are now taking up, you know, textbooks to learn Kyrgyz language and culture, and so I mean, these are interesting developments that are happening, and I think, yeah, and thank you for having me. This was a really interesting discussion.
Thank you very much. I can't agree more. It's been a very rich discussion, and I would like to thank our great panelists for it. Alima Abisyanova, Jan Botusevich, Shotaka Kabadze, and I want to thank our audiences. Thank you for tuning in and for your questions. Apologies for not answering all the questions. We received many. We tried to do our best. And let me thank my partners in crime, Dr. Marlene Leroy and Dr. Stephen Jones, for co-organizing this event. Thank you very much, and stay tuned.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah.